Okay, thank you. I hope you can hear me. Welcome to everybody, especially to our distinguished guests. I would like to start from going to very general question to probably more concrete things. And my general question concerns global social movements. Now, some skeptics argue that no matter how powerful or how forceful these demonstrations and various actions are, there's not really a coherent central ideology behind these movements. Others say that that's in fact a good thing, that diversity is basically the major force that is making these things work, and that's the advantage behind these movements. My question concerns this, that being faced with extremely centralized, very, very well organized organizations as such, is there a need for some sort of centralization within the movements themselves, or would that really lead to the movement falling apart as such?
Well, the movements that exist are a reflection of social reality. I mean, you can't make a decision to impose a central authority on widely decentralized movements all over the world, which have their own interests and concerns and share some general framework, but are working on particular problems. So landless workers in Brazil and peasants in India and steel workers in the United States and so on have some overall general concerns, like, say, protecting an environment in which their grandchildren can survive, or preventing nuclear war and so on. Those are general concerns, but they're very specific ones. It just would make no sense for someone to come along and say, okay, let's have a fixed central ideology that we all adhere to. Those, to the extent that such centralized ideological or general ideological positions develop, it's a reflection of the level of consciousness and commitment and engagement of the people. Is it a strength or a weakness? My own feeling is it's a strength. The centralized, I mean, this is, ever since if you look at the history, ever since the origins of the modern left and labor movement, the 19th century basically, a long-term goal has always been to develop some kind of an international. So every labor union is called an international, even if they don't go beyond their own city. There were, the first, second, third, and fourth internationals. They were all highly centralized and under pretty narrow elite control. The first international was actually destroyed by Marx personally when he couldn't control it any longer. The second one collapsed at the time of the Second World War. The third was just an instrument of Russian state policy, and the fourth is Trotskyist sectarian. What's happening now for the first time ever is the rise of a genuine international. If you look at the groups that come together, say in the World Social Forum, they represent a variety of people of a kind just unimagined by the first four internationals. In fact, the reason they meet in the South, first Brazil and then India, is because that's where they arose. They arose in southern, what's called the South, the Third World. And the North, the rich countries, became involved later on. And there's a tremendous diversity of people, walks of life, men and women, anything you can imagine is involved there, and they share plenty of concerns, and they work on very specific issues, and it's developing into what could be the seeds of the first genuine international. But then it is, where such social movements will go, of course, you can't predict. One of the best things about the World Social Forum, more than its annual meetings, is that it has spawned lots of regional social forums. Regional, local, some of them small towns have their own social forums, and they, adapt the general concerns to what their own particular live interests are. It can be rather local, and then it sort of feeds back into the general system. In fact, the World Social Forum itself meets alongside of other international meetings. So the last one I went to happened to be in Porto Alegre last year, but when I got off the airplane, I didn't go to the World Social Forum. I went to the Via Campesina international meeting. That's the International Peasant Association, which was meeting in parallel with the World Social Forum, but not really part of it. The international peasant organizations, which peasants are, after all, a large majority of the world's population, they have their own problems, and they were working on them. And there was some interaction with the World Social Forum. It's friendly and so on, but separate. And that's a healthy sign. I mean, it's a sign that people are dedicated to working on the real problems for them, not mouthing some ideology they learned somewhere, but also interacting with one another at whatever level is productive. So I personally, I think it's a healthy sign. But whether you think it's healthy or unhealthy, you can't decide to change it from outside. I mean, it does reflect the social reality of popular activism and protest, which is very, very widespread, probably more than ever in history, but extremely disorganized. Take, say, the United States. The level of activism in the United States is beyond anything in my lifetime, at least. On the other hand, if you take, say, the city where I live, Boston, people in one part of the town don't know that somebody in the other part of the town is working on the same issues. In fact, one of the reasons for, I spend a lot of my time just going around giving talks, and one of the main reasons for the talks is just to bring people together who wouldn't know each other otherwise, even if they're nearby or have similar interests and so on. It's a very atomized society. Much of the world is like that. That's, in fact, part of the kind of class war that's going on to keep people separated from one another, but it's real. And it has its strengths and its weaknesses, but you can't wish it out of existence.
Okay, let's have a different angle. A question from Erhard Miklos.
It's more just a follow-up to what he was saying now. I've read in one interview made with you, actually I have to apologize because my quotes are quite disordered and I'm not always sure who made the interview. In that interview you said about the Porto Alegre meeting, social forum, that the issues that had been dealt with there were quite serious, actually extremely serious. This was the word that you used, mostly compared with the frivolity of G4 or GATT meetings in terms of the issues that are put on the table. But now you said that this social movement is extremely disorganized, and it's maybe a bit forced, but I feel this parallel between being disorganized and being extremely serious, while on the other hand you have an extremely organized force that is quite frivolous. I don't know if this is a question already, but if yes, then I would like to ask you to react to it.
So can it be both disorganized and serious, basically? Yeah, in fact, take even the meetings of the World Social Forum. I don't know if any of you have been there, but if you go to the meetings of the World Social Forum, there are by now maybe 100,000 people there, plus many more in the side activities that are going on, like the Via Campesina. If you look at what's happening, there are intense discussions, often very constructive ones, about a huge variety of issues, and they themselves are separate from one another. So the people there are groups that are working on how you organize a future cooperative society to overthrow current institutions. There are others organized around how can we ensure that peasants have control of their own seeds, let's say. Others are concerned with gay rights. Others are working on environmental issues. How can we keep the world from being destroyed? Now, those are separate discussions. They're all very serious. But even in one collection of buildings, they're disorganized. So I don't see any. And in fact, the people can talk to each other too. Like they can give whatever comes up with in one group can be discussed with others. Although their concentration of interest is different, as it should be. So that's. I just don't see any problem of disorganization and seriousness have nothing to do with one another. In fact, the organized groups, let's say, there are, say, Marxist, highly organized groups with a strict ideology and so on. I don't regard them as particularly serious, although they're serious in the sense that they're a problem, a serious problem often, and disruptive, but they're very organized. So there's no, old Communist Party was very organized, didn't mean it was serious.
You mentioned that these movements, the social reform movements, begin or have their origins in the South and then are gradually moving north towards the US and Europe. Is there not a fear that, as I sense this especially in Europe, that these old ideologies cannot adapt to this diversity and this decentralized type of functioning, and will in fact, once in the northern context, try to sort of pressure themselves or force themselves on the side?
I mean, if you really look at it in detail, there are plenty of problems, both in the South and the North. There's a lot of dictatorial control. So the control over the World Social Forum meetings and activities in Brazil, in India, is heavily influenced by centralized groups in those countries, to the extent that participants often don't know what's going on. Things are being decided somewhere and you don't exactly know where. The European component, which is mostly French-based, comes from a highly authoritarian tradition. The French left is an extremely authoritarian tradition in its entire background, and secretive. So you don't, and they're pulling a lot of strings in the background that nobody quite understands. In fact, a friend of mine who was on the directing committee, the committee that was sort of organizing the meetings, told me last year that it was like being in the Politburo but not knowing who was in the Kremlin. I mean, the orders were coming from somewhere, and they somehow had to adapt to them. And they themselves were imposing structure, and the groups that were participating didn't like it because they're mostly much more kind of libertarian in a European sense, and didn't want to be controlled. So there's plenty of internal contradictions there. You can see it in the Workers' Party in Brazil, for example. I mean, it's a kind of a mixture of mass popular organizations and plenty of authoritarian control. That's one of the problems they're having right now in Brazil. So all the traditional problems are there. They didn't disappear. And these are kinds of struggle going on to try to maintain the structure of a really participatory organization which is free and internally democratic within the framework of a history of authoritarian domination and just tendencies towards it. I mean, any of you who are active in groups, small groups or large groups, know that there is just a natural tendency. You just have to resist towards centralization of control and authority. There just are certain people who are going to be interested in and willing to take on responsibilities and make decisions, and others are too busy or not interested enough or whatever. And groups can tend towards a highly authoritarian bureaucratic control, and those are just tendencies you've got to constantly be aware of and overcome. And when you get to huge international movements like these, of course it's there. It's not so much ideological, because there is no ideological center, but there are several control centers, and they're pretty obscure and quite disruptive. They make people pretty unhappy, and rightly, you know. So those are problems that have to be overcome in these movements. And if they're not overcome, they may destroy them, in fact.
My question was intended to be a bit more local. We know that this is the first time that you came to Hungary, and simply what I wanted to ask is what is your knowledge about this country, or generally about the post-communist bloc in Europe? You know, we have just joined the European Union, and we have been called by Mr. Bush being the new Europe and such things. So, if you could react to that.
Well, I'm not going to try to tell you about Hungary, obviously. But from the point of view of, say, Mr. Bush, I mean, the Western power, the attitudes towards Eastern Europe are important and interesting, and I'm sure you're aware of them, but you ought to be very aware of them. Just take the concept New Europe that you mentioned. It's a very intriguing concept. It reveals very dramatically the deep hatred of democracy on the part of U.S. elites, not just Bush, but the elite community and the educated, sort of managerial community in general. They despise democracy more than anything else, and for very good reasons. I mean, the way you can maintain centralized control is to make sure that democracy doesn't function. So if you go back through the history of the United States, back to its origins, there has been a struggle going on between, this starts right in the Constitutional Convention in the 1780s, between the elites who founded the country and imposed a structure on it, who despise democracy and want to maintain narrow control by wealth and power, and popular movements which are trying to create democracy. And this just goes, it's the whole of the history. Well, the Bush administration happens to be at the extreme end of a pretty narrow spectrum, but they're at an extreme end on just about every issue. And one of them is their absolutely visceral hatred of democracy, which is a passion. And it's revealed dramatically in this old Europe, New Europe distinction. So if you take a look at the way old Europe was divided from New Europe by, I mean, it started from the Bush administration, but then it went all over the journals and the intellectual discourse and so on and so forth. So it does represent a kind of a general picture on the part of elite opinion. There was a very sharp criterion that distinguished New Europe from old Europe, very sharp. I mean, it really takes discipline for Western intellectuals not to notice it, and they don't. But it's hard not to notice it because it's so dramatic. The criterion was straightforward. What was called old Europe, the bad people, the ones we're supposed to dislike and be angry about. So we can't eat French fries anymore. We have to eat freedom fries because we hate old Europe so much. Old Europe was the countries in which the government took the same position as the large majority of the population. Okay, that was old Europe. New Europe were the countries where the government opposed an even larger majority of the population. So if you look at old Europe and you look at the Poles, New Europe, so Spain, Italy, Hungary, and then you take a look at poll results, the population was even more opposed to going to war in Iraq than in old Europe. But the government disregarded the population, overwhelming majorities of them, and followed orders from Washington. That makes them good. So Berlusconi and Aznar and Eastern Europe are the good hope of the future because they take orders. In fact, some of them are very conscious of it, especially in the old Eastern Europe. For example, the foreign minister of Latvia was asked in the American press why Latvia agreed to support the war in Iraq, even though the population was overwhelmingly against it. And his answer could have been given by anyone in the former communist countries. He said, "We know that you have to say yes, sir, and do what the Americans tell you and help America. That's your job." And they know that from experience. That's the way you react to power. You say, yes, sir, thank you, I'll help you. If you accept those views, you're good. You're New Europe. You're the hope of the future. If you, on the other hand, if a government takes the same stand as its own population, terrible. You know? In fact, the most dramatic case of all was Turkey. Turkey, to everyone's surprise, mine as well. I know Turkey fairly well, but to everyone's surprise, the government finally agreed to go along with 95% of the population. And U.S. elites were absolutely shocked. They were infuriated. They were immediately told by Colin Powell, the great moderate, that they'd be punished for this. Paul Wolfowitz, who's depicted as, they call him the idealist in chief, the great visionary who's leading the crusade for democracy, he went so far as to condemn the Turkish military because they didn't overrule the government, or they didn't overthrow the government. And he told them they had to apologize to the United States, literally, and say that they will understand that their job is to help America. Then they'll be real Democrats. All of this passed without any comment, you know, as if it's perfectly natural. And it is perfectly natural for elite opinion which simply despises and fears democracy with a real passion. I mean, it rarely shows up that clearly. Interestingly, that's understood outside of Western elite intellectuals. I don't know about Hungary, but it certainly is in other places. For example, Iraq. It's quite dramatic to see the attitudes towards about this question in Iraq and in the West. By the West, I mean mostly the United States and England. That's where I follow the press most closely and commentary. So the standard line, like 100% of commentary close to it in the United States and England, is that they invaded Iraq to bring democracy to Iraq and to the Middle East and to the world. There are critics, but if you look at the critics, what they say is it's a wonderful, noble, generous effort, but it's beyond their reach, or the people don't deserve it, or it's not going to work, or something like that. But to find somebody who, you have to look very hard to find anyone who questions it. What's the evidence for it? Well, the evidence for it is our leader announced it, and that proves it. Once the dear leader has announced that our mission is to, it's sometimes called his messianic mission, to bring democracy, once he's announced it, it becomes true. If you're a deeply committed totalitarian, so deeply committed you can't even question totalitarian beliefs, that's enough evidence to make it true. All right, that's essentially the entire Anglo-American intellectual class. You really have to look hard to find an exception. And nobody sees anything odd about it, which is kind of curious, because first of all, if you accept this view, you also have to accept the view that Bush and Blair are among the most accomplished liars in history. Because when they tried to organize the countries to go to war, that wasn't the story. The story was, we have to go to war to defend ourselves from, you know, weapons of mass destruction and terror and so on. But after all that collapsed, it turns out that the real reason we went was because of our messianic vision. And if you're a well-disciplined intellectual, you went to the best universities like Oxford and Harvard and so on, that's just built into you. You just accept reflexively what the leaders say, even if you have to overlook the fact that they're saying we were lying before. So in the West, that's like close to 100%, including the critics. Now, there are polls in Iraq. The West is constantly carrying out polls in Iraq to try to figure out how to deal with the population. Right after President Bush made his speech in which he declared his messianic vision to great applause, there was a poll in Baghdad in which people were asked, why do you think the United States invaded? And some agreed with unanimous opinion in the West, 1%. 1% of people in Baghdad said the purpose was to bring democracy. 5% said the purpose was to help Iraqis. The rest said what's completely obvious but inexpressible in the West. The goal was to take control of Iraq's resources and to use it as a base for reorganizing the Middle East and American interests, which is obviously true. But you simply can't say that in the West. That's just unspeakable. So that's the difference between people at different ends of the club. It's very common. I mean, victims and people who hold the club have a different picture of the world on just about everything. And it goes way back. Now, if you want to learn something about reality, you don't ask the people holding the clubs. You don't ask the policemen and the intellectuals and so on. You ask the people who are the victims. They generally have a much clearer picture of it. I mean, this is true of international society. It's true of the smallest social units. I mean, take, say, a family. I mean, if there's a patriarchal family and you want to figure out what's going on, you don't ask the husband. You ask the wife. They're going to have very different pictures of what's going on. And one of them's real. The other's the way it looks if you got the club in your hand. And that's true on this, too. The old Europe, New Europe thing is extremely interesting. But what it tells you about the Western intellectual culture is very revealing. Actually, there's more behind it than that. As usual, there's some geopolitical reality behind it. If you look at what's called old Europe, the bad ones, that's primarily Germany and France. Well, Germany and France are the heartland of Europe. I mean, that's the commercial, industrial, financial heartland of Europe. New Europe, the good guys, is the periphery. Spain, Italy, Latvia, Hungary, I mean, the fringes. Well, and the hatred of old Europe has much deeper roots than just hatred of democracy. It goes way back to the end of the Second World War. I mean, after the Second World War, the United States was, of course, in a position to run the world. There was no question about that. But they recognized that there are potential problems. And one of the potential problems is Europe. Europe might go off in its own direction. It's not a law of nature that Europe is going to just be a client of the United States. In the early post-war period, it was clear. I mean, it was mostly conquered. But it was going to recover. There's no doubt about that. France and Germany were going to recover, and the rest of Europe would slowly recover and become a major industrial and commercial society again, and of course it happened. And from right away, the early 1950s, there were concerns that Europe might become what was then called a third force, independent of the United States and Russia. And that's the main reason for the formation of NATO, and the reason why NATO remains today, when there's nobody can pretend there's a Russian threat, is that NATO is a mechanism by which the United States maintains control over Europe. As long as the NATO framework functions, the United States will dominate, because not in economic power or cultural power or anything, but in military force, the United States so overwhelmingly dominates the world that nobody's even close. So if anything ever shifts to the military arena, the United States will run it. That's one of the reasons why the United States constantly tries to drive policies towards military confrontation. That's the dimension in which the U.S. is supreme. That's not, I mean, England goes along. It's sort of a client state, but Europe is very capable of moving off in an independent direction. Part of the reason why the United States has been so eager to have the European community and NATO extend to the former satellites is it assumes that they will be more under U.S. control. So the assumption is that in Eastern Europe, for one thing, there are more illusions about the United States. Having been under Soviet domination creates illusions about the alternative. If you lived in Central America, you wouldn't have any illusions about the United States. But if you live in Hungary, you would have illusions. And it's assumed that those illusions will carry over. And also that they'll be like the foreign minister of Latvia. They'll know that your job is to say, yes, sir, we have to help the Americans. And that, it's hoped, will weaken the likelihood that a unified Europe might simply move off in its own direction and become an independent force in world affairs, which is one of the major problems of world control. Actually, it's one of the major reasons why the United States is in the middle, wants to make sure that it controls Middle East energy. It's been understood back since the 1940s that the main energy resources of the world are in the Persian Gulf region. And by now, it's expected that about 2/3 in the next few decades will be in the region of the Persian Gulf. And whoever controls those energy resources has a very powerful lever for controlling others. I go back to the early 1950s, U.S. planners understood that control of Middle East oil would give them what they called veto power over moves towards independence in Europe, and at that point they were thinking about Japan. And that's why there's such a struggle going on right now about who controls the oil resources and who decides where the pipelines are going to go from Central Asia to somewhere. The United States wants to make sure Central Asia is not on a scale of the Middle East, but it's fairly substantial. And there's a big battle about whether the pipelines are going to go to the east, to China and Japan and South Korea and this major industrial center there, or are they going to go to the west? And if they go to the west, the United States wants to make sure that they don't go through Russia or Russia-controlled areas, and they don't go through Iran, but they go on some complicated route which ends up being under U.S. control all the way, ending up right in Albania, in fact. A good part of the reason for controlling Kosovo is to make sure that you end up with the pipelines staying under control. So if you look at the pipelines that are planned, they go in a very strange route, but ending up in regions that are always under U.S. control. And that's important if you want to control the world. And part of the concern about so-called old Europe is that it is the center of a potential independent Europe, which can't be tolerated.
We have a variety of questions from the audience. Let me read out a few of them. About 3 sets of questions I will try to present to you. First set, is there a chance that the democracy in the USA is going to turn into an oligarchy? That's one question, and I'd like to read out this one, accompanied with the previous. One of the logical possibilities behind the 9/11 attack is that directly or indirectly the Bush clan is behind it. After all, they benefited most from it. The establishment media ignores this issue. This is the usual conspiracy theory. Do you have any evidence, pro or contra, or do you know of any evidence? Another set of questions.
Why don't we? I'll forget.
Answer it. Okay.
Yeah, I'll forget them.
Thank you.
Yeah. Let me start with the second one, then go back to the first one. The first one's more complicated. The second one on whether, first of all, did the Bush administration gain from September 11th? The answer, yes. Does that tell you anything? No. Every authoritarian system in the world gained from September 11th, and it was immediately predictable. I mean, I remember my first interviews with journalists a couple hours afterwards. The first question I was asked is, about this, and I said, look, every power system in the world is cheering. The Russians love it. It's giving them an excuse to increase their atrocities in Chechnya under the pretext that they're defending themselves from terror. The Chinese love it. They're going to step up their atrocities in Western China against the Uyghurs, claiming it's defense against terror. Indonesia loves it. They're going to go on a rampage in Aceh and massacre everyone because they have to defend themselves against terror. Ariel Sharon will, go wild in the occupied territories because we have to protect ourselves from terror. And so it continues. In fact, just about every country, I mean, the more violent ones just extended their own violence, but the less violent ones, say like England or the United States or France, immediately imposed what they called protection against terrorism acts of one kind or another, which had almost nothing to do with terror, but a lot to do with disciplining their own populations. So if you take a look around the world, the more, what are called the more democratic societies, instituted mechanisms of control of their population under the pretext of defending themselves against terror. So, and this was completely predictable. I mean, this happens after, even after an earthquake, things like this happen. Power systems will exploit it to expand their own power over their primary enemies, which are their domestic enemies, their own population. And if they happen to be carrying out violent repression, they'll extend it. So the fact that the Bush administration gained from it, although true, that doesn't seem to me to tell you anything. It just says they're just one of the power systems in the world, so they gained from it. Did they plan it in any way or know anything about it? This seems to me extremely unlikely. I mean, for one thing, they would have had to have been insane to try anything like that. First, if they had, it's almost certain that it would have leaked. You know, it's a very porous system. Secrets are very hard to keep. So something would have leaked out, very likely. And if it had, they'd all have been before firing squads, and that'd be the end of the Republican Party forever. You know, to take a chance on that, even if you could control what would, further, it was completely unpredictable what was going to happen. I mean, you couldn't predict that the plane would actually hit the World Trade Center. I mean, it happened that it did, but you know, could easily have missed. So you could hardly control it. But what you could be almost certain of is that any hint of a plan would have leaked and would have just destroyed them. And to take a chance on something like that would be meaningless. Now, if you look at there's a big industry in the United States on the left as well. I mean, you should see the email that I get. There's huge internet industry from the left trying to demonstrate, and there's books coming out that were bestsellers in France and so on, that this was all faked and it was planned by the Bush administration and so on. If you look at the evidence, anybody who knows anything about the sciences would instantly discount that evidence. I mean, there's plenty of coincidences and unexplained phenomena, and, you know, why did this happen and why didn't that happen and so on. But if you look at a controlled scientific experiment, same thing is true. I mean, when somebody carries out a controlled scientific experiment at the best laboratories, at the end, there are lots of things that are unexplained, and there are funny coincidences and this and that. If you want to get a sense of it, take a look at the letters columns in the technical scientific journals. You know, so like Nature or Science or something. The letters are commonly about unexplained properties of reports of technical experiments carried out under controlled conditions, which are just going to leave a lot of things unexplained. That's the way the world is. Now, when you take a natural event, you know, not something that's controlled, you know, most of it will be unexplained. There'll be all sorts of things that happened, and that, you know, you can afterwards you can put them into some kind of pattern, but beforehand you can't. And the pattern may be completely meaningless because you can put them into some other pattern too if you want. I mean, that's just the way complicated events are. So the evidence that's been produced, in my opinion, is essentially worthless. And the belief that it could have been done is so, has such low credibility that I don't really think it's serious. I should say that, you know, I'm pretty isolated on this in the West. I mean, a large part of the left completely disagrees on this and has all kind of elaborate conspiracy theories and, you know, about how it happened and why it happened and so on. But I think they're just, first of all, I think it's completely wrong, but also I think it's diverting people away from serious issues. I mean, just doesn't make any. I mean, even if we're true, which is extremely unlikely, who cares? You know, I mean, it doesn't have any significance. But it's a little bit like the huge energy that's put out on trying to figure out who killed John F. Kennedy. I mean, yeah, who knows, and who cares? You know, I mean, plenty of people get killed all the time. Why does it matter that one of them happened to be John F. Kennedy? If there was some reason to believe that there was a high-level conspiracy, it might be interesting. But the evidence against that is just overwhelming. And after that, it's just a matter, you know, if it happened to be a jealous husband or the mafia or someone else, what difference does it make? It's just taking energy away from serious issues onto ones that don't matter. And I think the same is true here. It's my personal opinion. The question of whether the United States has become an oligarchy is actually the wrong question, because it presupposes that it was once a democracy, but it wasn't. In fact, if you look at it's not even claimed to be. I mean, that's just public propaganda. But if you look at sort of, you know, political science literature, people who try to be more or less serious about politics, it's not even called a democracy. It's the technical term that's used for it is a polyarchy. Polyarchy is a system of elite control and public ratification. So the job of the public in a polyarchy is to show up every couple of years and push a button and choose among a small leadership group from essentially the same class and background and interests. And then the public's supposed to go home and buy shoes or something like that, but not involve themselves in public affairs. It's the job of the leadership, the responsible men, as they call themselves, to make the decisions. That's the way the country was set up. So again, you go back to the Constitutional Convention. James Madison, the main framer of the Constitution, was very explicit about it. He said we have to set up a system in which power is in the hands of what he called the wealth of the nation. The men who have, only men of course, the men who have sympathy for the rights of property owners and who understand that the goal of government is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. I'm quoting, actually. Those are all quotes from, you don't read that when you go to school, you know. But if you go back to the Constitutional Convention where they were talking openly, you know, that was the idea. And the political system was set up to have that result. I mean, that's why there's so much power in the Senate. The Senate was the wealth of the nation, and only elected occasionally every 6 years. And that's why there's so much power in the presidency as compared with parliamentary systems. And the effort to break the rest up into sort of factions and separate them and so on was part of a way of ensuring this. Well, as I said, this has been a struggle ever since. I mean, popular groups don't like it, so there's constant struggles to bring more democracy and constant efforts to repress them. And that's the whole of American history, you know, and it goes in cycles. You know, there are gains, there's repression, and so on. We happen to be in the middle of a very repressive cycle. It's reflecting what happened in the 1960s. In the 1960s, there was a tremendous wave of democratization. Lots of people just became engaged in the public arena and organized. Women, young people, you know, farmers, everyone. It was a period of enormous activism and engagement. That's one of the reasons why it has such a negative image. So if you read about the 1960s or you study about it in school, you're taught that it was a terrible time. It was called the time of troubles. You know, everything was horrible. Well, it was. There was a move towards popular engagement in democracy, and that had to be repressed. And this is all over the world. It's not just in the United States. It was the same in Europe, same in Asia, same in the former colonies were up and, you know, resistance movements were developing, liberation movements. It looked like the world was falling out of control. And since then, there's been a large-scale wave of repression on every front. Some of it's ideological, Some of it is in the international economy, the neoliberal mechanism, so-called. Their main role is to try to constrain democracy. I mean, they have a economic effect too, mostly harmful. But the most important aspect of them is directed against the threat of democracy. And that's happening internal to the United States as well in many different ways. And again, there's resistance. The activism that's going on, which is substantial, is a resistance to this. But there is no question about the United States becoming an oligarchy. It was designed that way. It's never been that different. In fact, you can just take a look at the election that's coming up in next November. Just take a look at it. The two candidates, they were both born into backgrounds of substantial wealth and political power. They both went to the same elite university. They both joined the same secret society in that university. It's Skull and Bone Society, which is to train rich kids into how to be rulers of the world, to get the right social attitudes and so on and so forth. They're able to run in the election because they're funded by the same institutions, the same financial and other corporate institutions fund them, so therefore they're able to run. And we call that an election. I mean, they had elections in the old Communist Party too. They did. They picked different people to run it. And this is an extremely narrow system. But there's a lot of propaganda. They're trying to tell people, particularly people, say, in Eastern Europe, that this is some kind of democracy. Well, yeah, it is some kind of democracy, but not political democracy. I mean, in many respects, it's a very free country. There's a lot of very good things about it. So the power of the state to coerce and control people happens to be very limited, unusually so, I think, unique in the world. And that's a good thing. And there are many good things, but political democracy is not one of them. It's got to be created. I mean, in many respects, the U.S. is what's sometimes called a failed state, a state with formal democratic institutions, but they don't function. And you can see that on policy issues all over the place. I mean, if you want, I can give you plenty of examples, but on major policy issues, crucial ones, which everyone regards as crucial, public opinion and elite opinion are completely different. And the result is that those issues simply do not appear in the political arena and are not discussed in the media, and people don't know much about them, and they have their feelings, but they can't turn into political issues because that's just not the way the country runs. If you look at the elections, the United States has an extremely powerful propaganda system, by far the most advanced in the world. I mean, the Russians, Germans tried to copy it, but they couldn't even come close in sophistication. It's called the public relations industry, which was created in the free countries. It was created in England and the United States for very good reasons. In England and the United States, about a century ago, elite groups came to understand that they are not going to be able to control their populations by force. Too much freedom has been won, so the capacity to control people by force had declined, and the only alternative is to control attitudes and beliefs. So they developed these huge industries, massive industries, to control attitudes and beliefs, and it just dominates the society. I mean, about probably $2 trillion a year in the United States is spent just on what's called marketing. Marketing is just propaganda. It's ways to try to induce you to devote your life and energy to something that'll keep you away from bothering people in power. Consumerism, going into debt, whatever it may be, just don't bother us. That's marketing. And it's an immense industry in the United States, England. By now it's spread to much of the rest of the world, but it's concentrated in the freer countries. These are modes of control. And, well, one of the things the public relations industry does is run the elections. So elections are run by the public relations industry. First of all, the financing of elections comes overwhelmingly from the corporate sector. Obviously, they have the money; they're going to finance it. Elections, since Kennedy, are mostly on television. That's the way of trapping people. But the public relations industry, which basically runs them, has an ideology that's pretty straightforward. I mean, they'll tell you about it. The ideology is to keep away from issues and to concentrate on what are called qualities. So the way you present a candidate is not, here's what I think about this or that issue, but you can trust me, or I'm a leader, or, I'm the kind of person you'd like to meet in a bar and have a drink with, or something like this. If you look at the campaigns, that's the way they're presented. You have to keep away from issues because most of the public disagrees on issues, and you don't want to get people involved in issues anyway. It's none of their business. So what you do is present people as you create characters. I mean, the people who run for office they come out of central casting. They're trained to speak and talk in certain ways. And take this whole business about Bush being a religious maniac. Maybe he is. I don't know. He could be about as religious as I am, for all I know. But everyone knows in the United States that about 40% of the population are religious fanatics. And I mean fanatics, kind of like the most extreme Islamic fundamentalists. Over half the population in the United States literally believes that the world was created 6,000 years ago. And about 40% are what are called evangelical Christians. They've had a born-again experience, saw Christ, he's going to save them, and this and that. Well, that's a huge voting bloc. And if you can pretend to be religious, you can try to gain the support of that. If you notice, every candidate in the United States on either party, ever since Carter, started with Carter, but ever since then, every single candidate has to at least pretend to be a religious fanatic. Well, it's partly to pick up that voting bloc. So, like, say, Bill Clinton, who, you can imagine how religious he is. But every Monday morning in the newspapers, and all the newspapers had front page photographs of Bill Clinton in church the day before, singing psalms, and so on and so forth. And the Bush people have pushed it to an extreme because, they're really harming the population, so they have to do something else to organize it. And it's the same with everyone else. And they all have to prove somehow that they have to they have to create characteristics which people may vote for. Well, these are all ways of undermining democracy. It's like trying to convince people to max out their credit cards on consumer goods that they don't want, or pay attention to, can you trust him, are all modes of preventing the threat of democracy from developing. And these are, for obvious reasons, major industries. Elite groups simply don't want the population to become involved in political and social affairs. It's much too dangerous. So again, asking whether the U.S. is becoming an oligarchy is just not the right question.
Thank you very much. Problems. Now, there are two scenarios about this. One says that this is an empowering, emancipatory thing, that you could see all of these things, and we are now seeing and knowing much more about what actually goes on. And there's another, much more pessimistic scenario, which is semi-Orwellian, saying that this is actually an extremely good way, this image war, to manipulate people on a much wider scale. How do you see the dynamics of this image thing?
Well, it is, from the beginning, say with the concept of embedded journalism, it was just a demonstration of extreme corruption of the media. No honest journalist would ever agree to be embedded in the military unit. That's saying I'm not going to be a journalist. If you're living and spending your time with a Marine battalion you're going to see life from their point of view. You can't help it. And just ordinary comradeship, or sharing of experiences, or coming under fire, or whatever it may be. You're going to be reporting the war the way the Marine Battalion wants to see the war. So the concept of embedded journalists is so grotesque, you can't even talk about it. Actually, many of the journalists, I don't know how many, but a lot of journalists just refuse. Some of them happen to be personal friends. One of the top the major Middle East correspondent for one of the major television channels is an old personal friend, and he refused to be embedded. He just traveled by himself, and they just didn't run his reports because he wasn't embedded. So he was telling what it looked like from some other point of view. So on the one hand, there's been a tremendous effort to control the picture. On the other hand, it isn't easy to do. I mean, there's too many sources of news and information now. So if people are, energetic enough, they can turn on Al Jazeera and get a different picture. That's one of the reasons why the U.S. keeps trying to shut it down. I mean, there's a very almost comical struggle going on between the United States and Qatar. Qatar is a dictatorship. The United States is supposed to be a democracy. The United States is trying to force Qatar to shut down Al Jazeera. And the Emir of Qatar is probably having fun, but he gives press conferences in Washington, which nobody ever reports, but they're kind of very funny. You get some, in which he lectures the American media on freedom of the press. He says, well, there is this concept of freedom of the press, which we believe in Qatar, so we're going to let it go. And meanwhile, Colin Powell is trying to get him to shut it down. But it's just too hard. In fact, the U.S. keeps bombing their headquarters. I mean, they bombed their headquarters in Kabul just before the U.S. Northern Alliance came in, so they wouldn't report. And they did the same in Iraq, and they kicked them out of Fallujah, and so on and so forth. But you just can't control it anymore. There are just too many sources of information, and when something leaks out and becomes prominent, and you don't say anything about it, you've lost any hope of being taken seriously. So things do get through. That's how the torture stories came about. So on the one hand, and there are plenty of journalists who do have professional integrity. I mean, even the ones who are embedded. They're not completely controlled. A lot of them really take their job seriously. So it's a very hard system to completely control. What you can control is the ideological framework, because that comes from the editorial offices and from the intellectual classes, and they are extremely disciplined. So you just don't get any questioning on things like, say, bringing democracy. I mean, that's, it would be like an Iranian journalist saying, I don't believe in God or something, or a Communist Party journalist saying, I don't believe in Marx or something. There's some things you just can't do, like questioning authority is just out. But that's part of the intellectual culture generally. It's not just the media. On the other hand, describing what's happening in front of your eyes, that's a lot harder to control, even if you're embedded. So there's very strict ideological control, but plenty of information leaking out. And that's, an inherent problem that even the best controlled media can't stop. I mean, take, say, the Russians during the pre-Gorbachev, before the beginning of opening up. If you look back at the Russian, some of you are old enough, you may remember how it was reported here, but I looked at the Russian journals in the early 80s to see how they're reporting the Afghan war. And they were reporting it pretty critically. I mean, this is under strict communist rule. But the Communist Party was sharply condemning the media because they were unpatriotic. Like they would show pictures of, Russian soldiers being in miserable conditions and everybody hates them and so on and so forth. And that wasn't the official picture you're supposed to present. It's supposed to be a picture of liberation. But it was getting into the Kremlin-controlled media to the extent that there were protests about it from the party hierarchy. You can tell me about your own experience, but I'll bet you it was true of the media here. during that period too. It's just very hard to avoid. And in a freer country, of course, it's even harder to avoid. So I think the general picture is ideological conformity, but leakage concerning information and facts. I should say that in the United States, this has been very carefully studied. One of the good things about the United States, as distinct from Europe, is that intellectuals tend to be more critical. European intellectuals think of themselves as very critical and adversarial and so on, but in fact there's almost no self-criticism in Europe. I mean, one sign of it is there's very little media critique. So if you take a look at Germany or France and so on, there's virtually nothing is done on critical analysis of the media. And the reason is because of illusions that are widely held among intellectuals about how independent they are. So there's nothing to study. Well, start studying it, you quickly find the opposite. But in the United States, where there happens to be a more critical attitude, there is a lot of media critique. And people's beliefs, say about Iraq, but lots of things, are studied and correlated with their media sources. So we have a huge amount of information about people's beliefs and where they're getting the beliefs from, and it's quite illuminating. It turns out that Americans are off the international spectrum in their beliefs about Iraq. So even today, a large number, probably close to half, believe that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction, and that Iraq was tied with Al Qaeda and it was involved in 9/11 and so on. Those beliefs were very high before the war. I mean, it's kind of hard to maintain them now, but they're still quite high. In fact, very large percentage of Americans believe that the world population supported the war. And I mean, you could hardly find a country in the world where there was 10% support. But people don't know that. They believe the world supported us, that there were weapons of mass destruction, they're involved in fact, part of the reason for the terror, the violence in the prisons, you have to really understand the people involved in it. The people carrying out the violence in the prisons are trained to believe that the people who they're torturing are the people who attacked the United States on September 11th. We're getting revenge. Look what they did to us. Now we're going to do it to them. That's the attitude that's ingrained in people, particularly in soldiers, where you can indoctrinate them more effectively. But it's a large part of the population, and I think that's the source of the general culture of terror and torture in the prisons. But those beliefs are still held, and of course, as you would expect, having those beliefs and supporting the war are very closely correlated, which is sensible. And if you have those beliefs, it makes sense to support the war. And they've also been traced to news sources. So it turns out, I don't know, those of you who know the United States, one of the popular television channels is called Fox News, very right-wing channel, which plenty of people watch, maybe a majority, or plurality at least. But people who will get their news from Fox News, about 80% of them have some totally crazed belief, which nobody in the world has. And it sort of goes down. People are getting their news from the New York Times, the mainstream elite press. About 50% have some crazy belief. Those who are getting it from National Public Radio, which is considered the independent intellectuals channel, about 25% have crazy beliefs that nobody in the world has. And this is excluding another part of the population which doesn't use any of these news sources. And this is kind of interesting. About over 20% of the population in the United States is getting their news from talk radio. Now, if any of you have been in the United States and listened to talk radio, you wouldn't believe it. From the part of the effort to break down the 60s dissidents was a major effort on the part of the right-wing foundations to buy up radio, because a lot of people listened to it. and they were able to take the talk radio. I don't know if you have this here, but there's this, you have a person running the radio program. People call in and they talk up and back and so on. The people who run it are so, you can't even call them right wing. They're in a different universe. I mean, there's just nobody like them in the universe. But they run talk radio, and that is the source of news for about 20% of the population. If you look at younger people from, say, 18 to 25, where most of them are getting their news are from late-night television programs, comedy programs, where you have, after the main channel primetime television news is over from, say, 11 o'clock on, there are these programs with talk show, sort of kind of comedy. I don't know how you describe it. If any of you have seen it, you know what I mean. But there's a little bit of information scattered around it. That's one of the main sources of news for younger people. So the media is a complicated story, but a lot is known about it. On the other hand, by now there are plenty of alternative media. So lots of people are just getting their information from the internet or from activist groups or other sources, and they have a very different picture of the world. And that you just can't control. And that's right at the core of the social movements. I mean, all of the social movements, their organizing and their interaction and so on, is internet-based by now.
Thank you. I try to put two questions to you, which come from about 20 little pieces of paper. A lot of questions came in concerning the structure of the movements that you were asked in the beginning and talked about. I read them out. How can a decentralized, disorganized movement fight successfully against centralized and organized capitalist institutions? Is this not an illusion? This is a question from Gordon Basha. Another question. If various forms of social activism don't need single agenda, in which sense can you talk about them being together? Is this struggle against control only that unites the movement, or nothing else? Any issues that unite the movement? Question from Peter Farkas, Attak, Hungary. A colleague of yours at MIT, Leslie Thoreau, said that everybody knows that capitalism has to be brought down, and the only ways that it can be brought down is through economic crash, world crash, or public revolution. Do you see any chances of any of these in the coming 5-10 years? Or any other way of bringing the system down? That should be enough for a first answer. But
well, first of all,
I wouldn't like to put any constraints on you, but we are running out of time.
Well, I'll try to be brief.
Okay.
Lester Thoreau is, we're in the same university, but to say we're colleagues is a little misleading. He was the director of the School of Management. So he's training people to become managers of major corporations. He doesn't think that the system should be broken down. You can be sure of that. He might have said that, maybe a crisis will come and it will break down, but that's not his commitment. The main question is, first of all, what's shared by the social movements? Well, if you take them all together, probably not much. But if you take very large components of them, quite a lot of things are shared, like attitudes on sexism, racism, aggression, militarism, existence of corporations, basic structures of capitalism, human rights. I mean, on those issues, a lot of things are shared, often down to considerable detail, like how a post-capitalist economy ought to run. There are many interesting questions about how you would run a society without managerial control or private ownership or state ownership and so on. On all of these issues, you do find a fair measure of agreement. I mean, if you go into real details, you'll get disagreement, but then there ought to be disagreement. Does anybody know the right answer to these questions? We don't really understand that much about human society and human life, or human beings. Now, you're going to have to figure these things out experimentally. So it's right to have general guiding sort of visions or some idea where you're trying to go, but to be exploratory and experimental in how you get there. Those are things that have to be discovered. So I don't really see that as a weakness. In fact, if you look at the history of what's called the ideological left, say the Marxist movements, they never had anything to say about a future society. Take a look at Marx. And Marx was a theorist of capitalism. You take a look at the whole Marx corpus, huge collection of volumes. There's about 5 sentences on what a post-capitalist society could be like. I mean, sentences you all memorized if you're the right age. You're going to be a fisherman in the morning and a doctor in the afternoon and that sort of thing. There's a couple of sentences like that scattered around. But the rest, there's no picture of a future society. In fact, Marx's actual proposals, Marx and Engels, are what we call reformist. If you read the Communist Manifesto, there's there'll be some future society, but what they're actually calling for are social reforms, social democratic reforms, and many of which have been instituted over the years. But there was no guiding ideology. It was supposed to be the iron laws of history, which are going to make certain things happen, and then the workers take over and something happens, but we don't know what. If you look at Leninist ideology, that was very clear and very simple. Follow me. Okay, that's a simple ideology. But between those two, there's almost nothing on the traditional left. The anarchists had a different point of view. They did develop conceptions of how a society ought to be organized and what you ought to do to build pieces of it in the present society and so on. But that's very characteristic of the contemporary movements. Even if they didn't read, they don't know the anarchist literature, they're sort of following the same path. You build pieces of a future society within the current one, and you try to erode its belief system, its attitudes, its structures of control, and so on, and gradually develop a more free, democratic society. I think it makes perfect sense. So can a disorganized movement overcome centralized control? Yeah, sure. It's happened right through history. In fact, every bit of progress you can think of has been like that. If there is a crash, suppose that some disaster takes place, which could happen. For example, it's quite likely, you can't make a probability, but it's not unlikely at all that there'll be some massive terrorist attack in the West, maybe in the United States, involving weapons of mass destruction, maybe nuclear weapons. It's really not that hard to sneak the parts of a small nuclear bomb into New York. We could probably do it with our limited talent. It really doesn't take much. There's tens of thousands of components of nuclear weapons all over the world, uncontrolled. Small nuclear weapons are really small, like 15 kilotons or something. Anybody can sneak anything they like over the Canadian border. You don't have to go through the airports. It's a huge border. It can't be controlled. There's most of the world's shipping, almost all of it, is in containers. Okay, containers are not inspected, and they can't be inspected. There have been some studies of what it would take to monitor the containers leaving Rotterdam and going to the United States. Turns out if you tried just to inspect those containers, all of Europe would be tied up in a massive traffic jam in which nobody could move, just plain gridlock, because of the amount of, the side effects of trying to inspect the containers. There's no conceivable way you can inspect those. And you can't tell what's inside them, maybe pieces of nuclear weapons. So the idea that there will be a major terrorist act in one of the Western countries, that's not unlikely. What would the effects be? Well, they could be the political effect, aside from killing and everything else. The political effects could be catastrophic. You can imagine anything. Or suppose, let's take another possibility. The world is very much oil-based, hydrocarbon-based, and that's increasing. Everyone knows who thinks that in the longer term, it's devastating. It'll probably destroy the environment. But there's a shorter term problem. It's going to run out. You don't know exactly when, but nobody doubts that it's a finite resource. And at some point it'll just become too expensive to extract. And that point may not be very far away. There aren't new discoveries being made. Most of the oil is known where it is, and nobody expects much to be discovered. So it'll, and in fact, discovery has peaked and is probably leveling, which means that, and usage is going up constantly because there are very few attempts at serious conservation. So there is a potential crisis brewing. And if it turns out in a short period that oil is not actually available at a sufficient rate, there could again be devastating effects. There are no plans, serious plans, for how to shift to a non-oil-based economy. Quite the contrary. I mean, planners are acting as if we don't have to worry about what's going to happen 5 years from now. What we have to do is make profit tomorrow. And that actually is built into the sort of state capitalist systems. You're not supposed to plan. You're supposed to maximize short-term profit. So there's a kind of a built-in catastrophe. Suppose it takes place. I mean, is that going to be good for the left? I don't think so. Any of these catastrophes are much more likely to lead to some kind of fascism, I think. That's not the way to bring about social change, to wait for a catastrophe. What you want to do is deal with these problems right now. And not a bad way to deal with them, I think, is through what are called disorganized movements. That means movements that have a lot of spontaneity and initiative and pursuing their own objectives and keep their mind on what other people are doing, but not necessarily feeling they have to have some ideology that they can follow. I mean, if you look over the past, there never have been ideologies. This idea that there were left movements with ideologies that told you what to do is just a myth. Just take a look at the ideologies. They're nothing. Leninism had no ideologies, and Marx didn't even talk about the topic. These are all mythologies designed to kind of aggrandize a centralized movements controlled by leadership groups right at the top, by making it appear that there's some ideology that says if you follow me, everything's going to work out. But that's about the limits of the ideology. It never existed.
I try to sum up a few more of these questions here. One of them quotes a quote that often goes in a magazine in the Hungarian Green Movement called Gaia, which says that the Green Movement is the enemy of nature if it doesn't question the core issues, the central issues, the most important issues. What do you think are the most important, most immediate core issues for the social movements or the Green Movement? That's one question. Another one is, if you were 25, 30 years old now, wouldn't you be afraid to have children? What do you think are the prospects for the coming 30 years? You partly answered that, but can reflect on it now as well. And this simply asks, okay, our slogan is, another world is possible. What are your practical hints for changing the world? What do you think we should do as activists? What are the most important things to do? Most immediate?
Well, that is very much like the first question, like what are the priorities? I don't see how any, I mean, I can tell you what I happen to be concerned about, but there's no reason why it should be what you're concerned about. I mean, what your priorities are depends very much on your circumstances and your interests and your concerns and who you are and you know, what your, where you want to impose, put your focus, your activity, and so on. I mean, there's any number of problems, all of them crucial. Like we've been talking about some, which are so crucial that they may determine whether the species survives. You know, and there are others that just permeate everybody's life, like racism and sexism, for example. They just permeate everybody's life. They show up all over the place. They're obviously major issues. And you can continue for a long list. Which are the primary ones? You know, there's no way to rank them. I mean, they all are interrelated. You work on the ones that somehow you feel you can do something about. But no point trying to rank them. What about having children? Well, you know, those of you who are my age will remember that it was a question then too. In the 1960s, there were my children, the children of my friends, many of them thought they weren't going to survive. The dangers looked so severe that there were plenty of, there are plenty of children who just became suicidal because it looked like there wasn't going to be any way to survive. Well, you know, by now the problems are more severe. How do you deal with it? Well, you don't solve the problem by not having children. You know, if one way to ensure that the species doesn't survive is not to have any children. You know? So that's not a constructive answer. But to try to create a world in which your children or grandchildren have a decent chance to survive, yeah, that's a major problem, but that's the other one again. Where do you attack it? Well, you know, where you feel you can. I mean, the entire structure of state corporate capitalism, including its ideology, is very destructive. In fact, even self-destructive, because it has built-in tendencies towards real catastrophe, and then it spreads out to the whole array of, you know, problems of life. I don't know how to prioritize them.
Isn't it of a likelihood, I cannot measure how big, that because of the movement being not ideologically or scientifically based, it can be easily influenced by corporate or state actors? Thank you.
First of all, I think we have to recognize that there never have been movements that were ideologically or scientifically based. They never existed. So the Marxist movements claimed to be ideologically and scientifically based, but there was no science and there was no ideology. This was just a mask for authoritarianism. So what was the science or ideology in the Marxist movements, for example? I don't think you can find it. You can find a lot of pretension, and there's a whole intellectual tradition of trying to discuss the science and so on, but you know, it's just not there. And the ideology basically was mostly a kind of follow me. There was not much in the way of ideology. The contemporary movements, I think, are much sounder in this respect. They're much more resilient. They don't have false beliefs in non-existent ideologies or fake science. But they're committed to, you know, they vary so much you can't generalize about them. But many of them are committed to very serious work on real issues. Does that make them susceptible to control by centralized power? Yeah. I mean, centralized power is not giving it up easily. They're going to fight back by every means they have. And there are many means. Marginalizing people through directing them to consumption is a major means of control. And we shouldn't underestimate how extreme it is. So in the United States is the most advanced country in this respect because it's the most free country. I mean, it's a credit to the American people that they're the most propagandized. The efforts to control them have to be much more extreme because there's so few ways to coerce people, thanks to previous triumphs. But advertising in the United States, you really have to. I mean, it amazes you when you study how it works. I've been interested in it. For example, there's a field of applied psychology, academic applied psychology, a major field of academic applied psychology, which is concerned with nagging by children. I don't know how you translate that into Hungarian. There's some Well, when children bother their parents to get them to do something, you know, it's called nagging. Everybody who has taken care of children knows about it. There's a field devoted to nagging, and there's a logic behind it. The corporations had been concerned for a long time about the fact that there is a big part of the population which could purchase things but doesn't have any money. Children, okay? So the big mass of people who are children, who you could somehow, you know, coerce into, by advertising, into buying things, but they don't have any money, so they can't do it. Well, brilliant thought came to someone. The way to do it is to get them to nag their parents. So now they've discovered, you know, half a dozen different kinds of nagging, and advertising for children is carefully designed and controlled to elicit the kind of nagging that might get the child to get their parent to buy this particular good. Incidentally, they're not called children. They're called evolving consumers. So the question is how you get evolving consumers to torture their parents into buying something that just to shut them up. I mean, I can see how it works with my own grandchildren. You know, they see something on television and, you know, the huge propaganda to make them think they've got to have it or their life comes to an end. And if it turns out to cost $800, it's not a second thought. You know, what's money? Your parents or grandparents have infinite amounts of it. You nag them to get that. Well, you know, these are techniques of control, and they start from infancy. I mean, if you watch, you know, sometimes watch television with my grandchildren from infancy, they are deluged with propaganda, which is aimed at making them perceive their own identity in terms of the number of goods that they have. There's nothing in your life except the goods that you have. Actually, if you watch American television programs, these have a very destructive effect in much of the world, especially in the third world, but even in Europe. I mean, American television programs, you know, comedies and so on, they give a picture of life, which is designed, of course, to be like that. It's a picture of life in which nobody works, nobody has a job, nobody has problems. The only kind of nobody's in jail, you know, and nobody's poor. Everybody's got everything you can imagine. The only problems you have are you're having a problem with your girlfriend or something like that. That's life, you know. Well, you know, there are plenty of people who are seduced by that vision of life. I mean, you get people all over the world who say, well, you know, why can't I live like that? I have to work and, you know, I have all these problems and so on. But there in that marvelous country, they don't have any of those things. You know, the relation to reality, you don't have to bother talking about. But it is a seductive picture, and it affects children. It affects people elsewhere in the world. It's a technique of control, very carefully contrived. I mean, a huge amount of effort goes into this. Are the popular movements subjected to it? Sure they are. I mean, they're subjected to enormous propaganda to make you feel that your own individual, what are called rights, which usually means right to consumption, is supreme, and nothing else exists. I mean, there are plenty of people within the popular movements who are caught up in the efforts to destroy any social organization within the society, like, say, schools. You know, public schools are a social commitment. So public schools are based on the idea of solidarity. Right? Public schools are based on the idea that you're supposed to care whether some child somewhere else can go to school. Well, you have driven into your head day after day that you're only supposed to care about yourself. You know, it's none of your business if that kid across the street doesn't go to school. It's his problem or his parents' problem. But you have no reason to pay taxes so that somebody else can do something. That's the government stealing money from you. You know, that's presented as the government stealing your hard-earned money to give away to somebody. And why should you agree to that? I mean, the amount of propaganda behind that is enormous. And it affects people all over the place. And there are other techniques of control. So, for example, since the 1960s, there's been a lot of concern about controlling young people, students, because of student activism. Well, one of the best ways to control people is to drive them into debt. So now, as distinct from the 1960s, when a student comes out of college, he's often deeply in debt. Tony Blair knows exactly what he's doing when he's increasing tuition, demanding a tuition increase in the British universities. That's not for economic reasons. You get way more than that by making corporations pay taxes instead of fleeing, you know. But it is a way of coercing students. I mean, if students have to pay tuition to get into school, for one thing, it has the obvious class effect. You know, it keeps out the poorer students. But the other thing is even for those who get in, they're going to end up college with a big debt burden. So suppose you graduate as a lawyer, let's say, and you decide you want to work on public interest law, you know, or environmental law or something, but you come out with a huge debt. Well, you know, the only way to deal with it is to go to work for a corporation and become a corporate lawyer. And pretty soon you get trapped into that, and then you can't get away from it. Those are techniques of coercion that constantly work. So sure, you know, there's everything from that to, you know, the Iraqis are going to come and kill us is a way of coercing people. I mean, in the United States, for example, if you look at the economy of the last 25 years, just the internal economy, it's a very unusual period in American economic history, in fact, unique. It's the first time, aside from major depression, that there has been stagnant real incomes. So for about 90% of the population in the United States, and this is pretty much true in England too, real incomes, you know, the amount of actual money that you have to buy things, is either stagnant or declining. It's about 90%. Also, work hours are going up. So people work much harder, and they're much more insecure. That's a crucial part of the economy, and it's conscious, is to make people insecure. There's a name for it in the economics literature. It's called flexibility of labor. And if you take an economics course, they teach you that's a good thing. You should have flexible labor markets. The flexible labor markets is a phrase that means when you go to sleep at night, you don't have to have a job the next morning. And that's good for the economy because if you're insecure, you're not going to try to get higher wages, and you're not going to join a union, and you're not going to do all those terrible things, and you're not going to ask for benefits, and that's healthy for the economy. There's a way to say it in academic graduate school prose, and there's a way to say it in simple words, but that's what it comes down to. Well, these are all techniques of control. Are people subject to them? You can't help it. Will they break up the social movements? That depends on the commitment of the people who are in them. Meaning, first of all, you have to become aware of all of these things, which is not so simple, and then you have to be willing to struggle against them and to create alternatives. You know, but that's what social struggle is about.
Amit az előbb ön mondott, hogy nincs, ami kikényszerítse az emberekről. Magyarországon nagyon sok ember és gyerek éhezik. Ez bizony nagyon komoly kényszerítő eszköz. Ezzel mit lehet tenni? Azt úgy gondolom, hogy nem elég, hogy élelmiszert adunk egyes embereknek, mikor ugyanakkor a gyerekeik is otthon éheznek, utcán laknak. Ezzel hogy segíthetünk? Mert ez igenis egy kényszerítő, egy gyilkos eszköz. Köszönöm.
Well, that's a problem exists everywhere. And so if you go to a country like, say, India, it could be half the population. If it's in the United States, it's maybe 15 or 20% of the population. I don't know what it is in Hungary. And you know, I can't, it'd be ridiculous for me to make a suggestion as to what you ought to do in Hungary. You have to make that judgment on the basis of Hungarian society and culture and so on. But everywhere in the world, it's basically the same problem. First of all, you have to somehow take care of people's immediate needs to try to keep them from starving. But behind that, you've got to build up the sense of solidarity and community that will make the rest of the society feel responsible for them. And beyond that, you have to dismantle the institutions that are causing it. And after all, it's not coming from nowhere. It's the result of the functioning of certain basically illegitimate institutions. And those are the stages. How you proceed with it depends on the circumstances you face. And only the people working in a particular community can answer those questions. There isn't going to be any master key, some magical answer coming from anywhere. There just aren't any. There never have been. How do you get rid of slavery, for example? There is no answer to how you get rid of slavery. You just work on it. And you work on it in whatever way is appropriate where you happen to be. Or how do you get women's rights, to take a more recent case? There's no answer. It depends on where you are, what the circumstances are, what you're able to do. There are never going to be any general strategies for these things. And so it's a mistake to expect them.
We set up now a scenario in a global level where we can see the elite in the overpower and the common people don't do nothing or anything.
The common people?
Yeah, all the local common people won't able to do anything. Cause the media, cause the live porns, cause anyways. And there's a movement, we are the activists, and what can we do? What's the difference between the internet communication and the direct action?
Well, first of all, the role of activists is not just direct action. I mean, direct action has its place, but the direct action, by direct action you mean like sort of demonstrations or breaking windows or whatever, that has its place, but its role is education. It's a tactic. It's neither good nor bad in itself. It's just a tactic. And it's a tactic that you carry out. Tactics are judged by their consequences. Okay, they don't have any intrinsic value. You ask them, they're good tactics, or they lead to good consequences, otherwise they're bad tactics. But direct action in itself is not has no value. If it is a way of leading to good consequences, yeah, it has value. Well, what are the consequences? I mean, the consequences are education and organization. That's the point of any kind of activism. Sometimes direct action may be a way to do it. Sometimes it may be harmful. That's what you have to ask. What about other techniques like consciousness-raising groups, or working wherever you happen to be to try to get people organized to take control of their own little part of the world, whatever it may be, in a workplace or a community or a family or anything else? Well, that's another kind of activism. Organizing groups to join the World Social Forum is another kind. Planning on this differs in different countries, but in the United States, one crucial and important kind of activism is simply anti-corporate activism. I mean, for the first time ever in the United States, and it's important, there's the beginnings of a movement to try to dismantle corporations. I mean, they are illegitimate institutions. They have no right to exist. And their control is very fragile. They know it. It's in principle easy to eliminate them and dismantle them. They understand it, and a large part of the corporate effort to appear benevolent, like give away cheap drugs to the poor and this sort of thing, is an effort to make sure that the population, actually you can read it in court decisions, they advise them to act benevolent so that an aroused population will not take away their rights, which are artificial rights. Well, for the first time, there's the beginnings of some kind of consciousness about that, and groups organizing to do something about it, and little parts of the country which are preventing corporations from functioning and so on. Those could grow into very powerful movements. I mean, it's much more important in the United States than in Hungary, just because of their role in the international economy. But similar things can happen anywhere. Well, what's the right choice? Well, we're back to that question again. It depends on an assessment of circumstances, of the conditions in which you live, on your own self-examination. What are you willing to do? But there's no reason why, the common people, everybody, can't be organized on these topics. People have interests and concerns, and mostly it's the same interests and concerns. People do feel helpless, but they're made to feel helpless. There's a major effort to make them feel helpless, and they really aren't. There are plenty of controls, but the controls can be dismantled and overthrown. After all, look, just take a look at the last century. Okay, at the beginning of the last century, 100 years ago roughly, there were several forms of totalitarianism that were beginning to develop. Okay, one of them was fascism, one was Bolshevism, and the third is corporations. They are all forms of totalitarianism. In fact, they come from the same intellectual roots. They all come from neo-Hegelian ideas about the rights of big organizations over the rights of individuals. And in fact, progressives supported all of them. Supported corporatism, supported Bolshevism, and supported fascism. Mussolini in particular had plenty of progressive support, because they all believed in the same ideas. Well, of those three forms of totalitarianism, two have been overcome. The third has extended. But the third is the weakest of all. It's held together just by propaganda, not by force. They don't have torture chambers. They don't have secret police. They have plenty of modes of control, but it's much more fragile. And there's no reason why the general population of the world can't overthrow those, the third one. But of course, you have to be aware of it in the first place. People aren't aware. And then you've got to begin to act at whatever scale you can act, and could turn into major social movements. Well, that would be a social revolution, major one.
So, we spoke before about the movement and its goals, and we could not sort of put a finger on any, but the word control was mentioned a lot recently now. It appears to me that many of the parts of the what you would call global social movements, they have big vested interest in big forms of control, like, for example, ensuring full-time employment for everybody. There has to be a lot of control on that, or big networks of social support, making sure that certain destructive, ecologically destructive ways of behavior don't occur. It seems like a lot of control is really needed by the movement itself.
Well, there's nothing wrong with control. So, for example, all my life been in favor of workers' control in industry. That's control. If industry is democratically run through, first of all, with the ownership, but then also the management of the workforce, that's workers' control. Fine. Something to strive for. So this control itself is neither good nor bad. It depends where it's coming from. If control is coming from above, it's illegitimate. If it's coming from below, that's what they want to achieve. And on any of the issues that you described, it's usually a mixture. If people are in anything connected to what we're calling the movement, are trying to change the world so that the levels of control are more in the hands of the people of the world and the communities in which they live and so on, and less in the hands of the authoritarian institutions. The control itself is fine.
I'd just like to know how you feel about lecturing about in front of different groups, wanting different parts of you, like academic person, the activist, the mobilization, the critical person, and you understand my question. How does it feel, and what is the situation like?
Personally?
Yeah, personally.
Well, no, look, if the world would go away, I would be perfectly delighted to concentrate on intellectually interesting and challenging questions. Okay. So, like an artist would like to, I'm sure you would like to spend your time on challenging projects. You know? And every human being would like to do that. We all have our creative impulses and so on. You'd like to work on them. But the world's not going to go away. So there's conflicting pressures and demands. To what, and you have to just decide for yourself. I mean, how much time am I going to spend going to concerts, and how much time am I going to spend trying to help the homeless? There can't be an answer to that. You know? No human being is so saintly that they dedicate themselves totally to helping other people. You couldn't survive you couldn't even survive that way. Nor would it be a healthy life for an activist or anyone else. So you figure out how you're going to live your life. You know, okay, figure out some kind of balance. As far as the talks are concerned, they're overwhelmingly political. I mean, I come to places and give technical talks, but only if it's part of something else. And those talks are mostly, almost all, a response to local organizations. I mean, some local organization, as I mentioned in the United States, but in fact in most of the world, people are just very disconnected from one another. You know, they're separated by all sorts of mechanisms. And one of the points of having big meetings where a couple thousand people come together, or even a couple, maybe 50 even, but it's usually thousands by now, is people just get to know each other. I mean, people who are working in one part of town find out that somebody in another part of town is doing something similar. And a lot of the speaking is, especially in the United States, is that. It's initiated by local organizations. I mean, often for fundraising or something like that, but often just to try to bring people in and try to bring people together and get them to, energize them to work with each other. So if a talk is well organized, a large component of it is organization. So people aren't just supposed to come and listen to a talk and go home. They're supposed to be offered something to do and say, well, here's what we're working on. Why don't you join us and do this? And many different things. In fact, those are the ways that good talks are organized, serious ones. And I try to do those as much as possible. Again, I don't know an answer, and it's going to be a different answer for every person. And it should be. I mean, after all, we're all different people with different interests and concerns.
Thank you very much for your answers. We'll do our best today to have not just a talk like this, but to bring as many people in our organizations and networks as possible through our little leaflets out there. And through talking to each other at the stands out there, so be involved, get organized. I'd like to thank the audience for their attention and their questions. I'd like to thank our guests in the panel for their warming up questions. And I'd like to especially thank Mr. Chomsky for being here answering our questions. And I'd like to ask Tracy Wheatley, one of our organizers, to present a little gift to Mr. Chomsky. It's a t-shirt having a logo.